I want you to fix Slytherin House." Hermione sat perfectly still. The headmistress's office was quiet. Fawkes's old perch was empty. The portraits on the walls pretended to sleep. Hermione chewed her bottom lip. She looked at the massive stack of files in her lap. Then she looked back up. "Fix it, Professor." Minerva McGonagall looked tired. Older than last year. The war had taken a lot out of everyone, but the headmistress wore it in the lines around her mouth. "Enrollment is down to single digits for the first years," McGonagall said. "The rest of the school treats them like criminals. They sit alone at meals. They don't join clubs. The house is dying, Miss Granger. If something doesn't change by the end of the term, the Board of Governors will vote to disband Slytherin entirely." Hermione frowned. She adjusted the stack of parchment in her hands. "I am the head girl." Hermione said. "You are. I have 8 NEWTs to study for. I am aware. I'm also a Gryffindor." Hermione pointed out the obverse. "A Muggle-born Gryffindor. I spent the last several years running for my life from people wearing those house colors. Which is exactly why you are the only one who can do this." McGonagall leaned forward. "If a Slytherin tries to run a public relations campaign, it looks like damage control. If the great Muggle-born war heroine does it, people will listen." Hermione's fingers curled into tight fists against her knees. Her beautiful, color-coded revision schedules were about to be ruined. If she took this, she would be dragged right back into the mess she was trying to avoid. She'd have to mediate between houses that hated each other. She'd have to spend hours trying to fix something that was probably already broken beyond repair. "I formed the Slytherin Integration Committee," McGonagall said. She slid a long piece of parchment across the desk. "You are the co-chair." Hermione checked the empty signature line. "Who is the other chair?" McGonagall gave her a very thin smile. "The only 8th-year Slytherin who bothered to return." The Gryffindor common room was loud, warm, and entirely chaotic. Hermione sat at the corner table. She was surrounded by 3 distinct piles of parchment. One stack was for arithmancy. Another was for ancient runes. The largest pile was covered in aggressively underlined notes about house unity. Ginny Weasley dropped into the chair across from her. "You're actually doing it," Ginny said. "I am the head girl." Hermione didn't look up from her notes. "It is my responsibility. It's a suicide mission. And a waste of time." Ginny reached over and picked up a sheet of paper. She read it aloud. "Interhouse tea pairings." "Hermione, be serious. Tea is very calming. Slytherins don't drink tea. They drink black coffee and the blood of their enemies." Hermione snatched the paper back. "That kind of prejudice is exactly why this committee is necessary. They are just students, Ginny. The first years are 11 years old. They didn't fight in any wars." "I know." Ginny sighed. She slumped back in her chair. "But they have a terrible reputation for a reason. And you're partnering with the ferret to fix it. He is the senior Slytherin. He's a nightmare. He hasn't spoken a single word in potions all term. He just sits in the back and glares at the cauldron like it insulted his mother. He's probably going to hex you the moment you walk into the dungeons. That's just his face. And he won't hex me." McGonagall would have his head. Ginny laughed. Good luck, Hermione. You're going to need it. Hermione checked her notes. The schedules suddenly looked very fragile. She had a terrifying thought that Ginny was right. Malfoy was unpredictable. He was angry. He was the last person who would want to sit in a room and plan public relations campaigns with a Gryffindor. But she couldn't back down now. She was Hermione Granger. She didn't abandon projects. Hermione froze in the doorway of the deserted, crumbling Slytherin common room. It was freezing. The lake water outside the massive windows was dark and murky. The silver lamps on the walls flickered. Half of them were burnt out entirely. The green leather sofas looked worn, their stuffing pushing out of the seams. A cold draft swept across the bare stone floor. It didn't look like a common room. It looked like a tomb. Hermione pulled her Gryffindor scarf tighter around her neck. She had her clipboards. She had her meeting agenda. She had 20 different ideas for inter-house study groups and a revised Quidditch practice schedule. She expected a crowd, or at least a hostile group of upper years ready to sabotage her. Instead, the room was empty. Almost empty. A single figure sat in the darkest corner of the room. Draco Malfoy. He wore a perfectly tailored black jumper. His legs were stretched out toward the weak fire in the hearth. A book rested on his knee, but he wasn't reading it. The shadows under his eyes looked like bruises. He didn't lift his head when she walked in. The meeting was supposed to start 10 minutes ago, Hermione said. Her voice echoed off the damp stone walls. It sounded too loud. Malfoy slowly turned a page in his book. I heard you the first time, Granger. You don't need to shout. His tone was dry. Clipped. Completely deadpan. Hermione marched across the room. She dropped her heavy stack of files onto the nearest table. The noise made him flinch, just slightly. His posture went completely rigid for a split second. Where is everyone? Hermione asked. Malfoy finally raised his eyes. His face was a blank mask. Cold. Untouchable. He looked completely indifferent to the fact that his house was falling apart around him. They are studying, Malfoy said. Or sleeping. Or trying not to get cursed in the corridors. I don't keep track. This was a mandatory house meeting. There are no mandatory meetings anymore. No one cares. Hermione aggressively organized her parchment. She lined up the edges. She tapped her quill against the wood. McGonagall cares, Hermione said. I care. And you're the co-chair of this committee, so you should care. Malfoy closed his book. I didn't agree to be on a committee. You are the only 8th year in this house. You're the de facto head boy. I am a pariah, Granger. Malfoy stood up. He was taller than she remembered. I am a former Death Eater sitting in a damp basement. I am not a committee chair. Slytherin is going to be disbanded. Good. Hermione stopped tapping her quill. She observed him. Really watched him. He stood perfectly still, but his hands clenched tightly inside his pockets. A tense, defensive stance. He was lying. You don't mean that, Hermione said. I absolutely mean that. Let the board close it. Let them sort the remaining kids into Hufflepuff. It would save everyone a lot of trouble. The first years are terrified. Malfoy's shoulders went rigid. Hermione pushed her advantage. She stepped closer. "I saw them at dinner today," Hermione said. Her voice went fast and earnest, the words tumbling out of her mouth. "They sit huddled together at the end of the table. No one talks to them." A third-year Gryffindor threw a roll at a first-year Slytherin's head yesterday, and the Slytherin actually apologized. Malfoy turned his head. He kept his eyes fixed on the dark lake water outside the window. "I can't fix that," he said. His tone was quieter now. "We can." Hermione tapped the main file. "I have a plan. An inter-house mentorship program. Study groups mixed by year, not by house. A complete public relations overhaul for the Slytherin image." Malfoy faced her again. He checked the files. Then he checked her expression. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You want to rebrand Slytherin?" "Yes." "With study groups?" "It's a start." Malfoy crossed his arms. "You're insane. They hate us. A study group isn't going to make them forget the war. It will show them that you're trying." "I'm not trying." "You showed up tonight. I live here, Granger. This is my common room. You were waiting for me. I was reading." "You were reading a book that was upside down." Malfoy blinked. He glanced at the volume on the table. It was, in fact, upside down. A tiny spot of color appeared on his pale cheeks. He recovered instantly, his features sliding back into the cold, untouchable mask. "It's a very complex text." Malfoy said flatly. Hermione almost smiled. She bit her bottom lip instead. She pulled a chair out and sat down. She pointed to the empty seat opposite her. "Sit down, Malfoy. We have work to do." Malfoy didn't move. "I am not participating in this." "You already are. Now sit." He glared at her. It was a spectacular glare. It was the kind of look that used to send first years running in the opposite direction. Hermione just pulled out her agenda and uncorked her ink. Slowly, reluctantly, Malfoy took the seat. He kept his arms crossed. He kept his posture defensively closed. "Read the first proposal," Hermione said. She slid a document over to him. Malfoy glanced down at it. He didn't uncross his arms. He just read the top line. "Inter-house tea pairings." He read aloud. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. "Yes," Hermione said proudly. "Once a week, a Slytherin is paired with a student from another house for afternoon tea in the Great Hall. It promotes casual conversation in a structured, non-threatening environment." Malfoy lifted his chin. He met her gaze. "Granger." "Yes?" "If you force a terrified Slytherin first year to sit at a table and drink tea with a Gryffindor, the Gryffindor is going to poison the tea." "They will not." "They absolutely will. Or they will slip a babbling beverage into the sugar bowl. It's a security risk. It is tea, Malfoy. It is a fundamental British institution. It is an ambush with scones." Hermione groaned. She grabbed the proposal and shoved it to the bottom of the pile. "Fine. We skip the tea. Let's look at the Quidditch schedule." She pulled out a new sheet. Slytherin currently practices at 6 in the morning on Tuesdays. If we change that to 4 in the afternoon on Thursdays, the practice overlaps with the Hufflepuff team. They can share the pitch. Malfoy didn't even check the paper. No. Why not? Hufflepuffs are very accommodating. Because Slytherin doesn't have a Quidditch team. Hermione stopped. She studied him. What do you mean? I mean we don't have a team. We have 4 people who own brooms and 3 of them are terrified of heights. The captain graduated 2 years ago. No one stepped up. You're the seeker. I was the seeker. Malfoy's tone went completely flat. I don't play anymore. But it's Quidditch. It's the most public thing a house does. Which is exactly why we aren't doing it. The last time a Slytherin got on a broom in front of a crowd, someone threw a bludger at his head from the stands. Hermione fell silent. She checked her carefully drawn schedule. She had color-coded the overlapping practices in bright yellow and green ink. It suddenly felt incredibly foolish. I didn't know that. She said softly. Of course you didn't. Malfoy leaned back in his chair. You live in Gryffindor Tower. You don't see what happens down here. The silence in the room stretched out. The only sound was the crackle of the dying fire. She watched Malfoy. He seemed so tired. He looked like someone who had been fighting a losing battle for a very long time. She took a slow breath. She reached for a blank piece of parchment. Okay, Hermione said. Her tone was entirely serious now. No tea. No Quidditch. What do we do instead? Malfoy stopped breathing for a second. It was a tiny shift in his expression, a slight parting of his lips. He clearly expected her to yell at him. He expected her to give up and storm out. He didn't expect her to ask for his help. We survive. Malfoy said. We keep our heads down. We don't give them a reason to look at us. That's not a plan. That's a surrender. It's practical. It's cowardice. The word hung in the air. Malfoy's eyes went dark. His jaw tightened so hard Hermione could see the tendons stand out in his neck. Excuse me? You heard me. Hermione leaned forward. Her blood was pumping faster now. This was the friction she knew how to handle. You are sitting in the dark, feeling sorry for yourself, while your first years get bullied in the Great Hall. You are letting the entire school dictate who you are. That is cowardice. You have no idea what you're talking about, Granger. Then tell me. Hermione slapped her hand down on the table. Help me fix this. Stop fighting me and help me. They held each other's gaze across the distance of the small table. He breathed in. He breathed out. He inspected the official committee charter sitting on the edge of the table. Sign the parchment, Malfoy. Hermione held out the silver quill again. Her hand was completely steady. Malfoy didn't touch the quill. He examined her features. He noted the absolute, stubborn determination in her eyes. You're going to be completely insufferable about this, aren't you? I have already color-coded the first 3 weeks of our schedule. Malfoy let out a long, slow breath. He reached across the space. His fingers brushed against hers as he took the quill. His hand was freezing. He pulled the document toward him. He didn't read it. He just signed his name on the bottom line with a sharp, angry flourish. The black ink looked stark against the white paper. He threw the quill down. "Fine," Malfoy said. "But if you suggest matching house scarves, I'm throwing you in the lake." "We'll see," Hermione said. She pulled the charter back. The ink was still wet. They were officially bound together. Malfoy didn't say another word. He stood up, grabbed his upside-down book, and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the boys' dormitories. Hermione sat alone in the freezing common room. She traced his signature with her eyes. She had a lot of work to do. Part 2. The collision. The library table was too small. It was a very simple, undeniable fact. It was designed for one student. Maybe two, if they were very small and didn't require much parchment. Hermione Granger required a lot of parchment. Draco Malfoy was currently taking up half the table with a single, perfectly aligned piece of blank parchment and an expensive silver inkpot. He wasn't writing anything. He was just occupying the space. "You're in my margin," Hermione said. Malfoy didn't look up. He slowly turned a page of his book. It was right side up this time. "I am sitting perfectly still, Granger. Your elbow is crossing the center line. There is no center line." Hermione reached into her bag. She pulled out a long, bright red quill. She uncapped it, pressed the tip to the wood of the table, and drew a perfectly straight red line exactly down the middle. She capped the quill. She looked at him. "There is now." Malfoy looked at the red line. He checked her heavily color-coded agenda. Then he met her eyes. "Did you actually just draw on a library table?" "It's a temporary ink spell. It fades in an hour. Madam Pince is going to ban you from the restricted section. Madam Pince supports house unity." Hermione tapped her wand against her stack of parchment. "Now, please move your elbow back to the Slytherin side of the table." Malfoy sighed. A long, put-upon sound. He slowly slid his arm half an inch to the left. The sleeve of his black jumper brushed against her wrist as he moved. The contact lasted less than a second. But the sudden warmth of him was entirely unexpected. Hermione pulled her hand back, suddenly very focused on her notes. "Right," she said, her voice slightly higher than normal. "The inter-house mentorship program. I have drafted the preliminary matching criteria." She slid a thick packet of parchment across the red line. Malfoy looked down at it. He didn't pick it up. 30 pages. He said, "It's thorough. It's a manifesto. It's a detailed methodology for pairing younger students with older, responsible mentors from a different house. We are matching them based on academic strengths, extracurricular interests, and psychological profiles." Malfoy finally picked up the packet. He flipped to the second page. "You want to pair a first-year Slytherin who likes potions with a fifth-year Gryffindor who plays Quidditch." "Yes. Because their psychological profiles match. They both value determination and focus." Malfoy dropped the packet back onto the table. "Granger." "What?" "The fifth-year Gryffindor is going to push the first-year Slytherin into a cauldron." "No, they won't. The program includes a strict code of conduct." Malfoy leaned back in his chair. He crossed his arms. "You think a piece of paper is going to stop a blood feud? It is not a blood feud. It's a school rivalry that got out of hand. People died, Granger. The words hit the table like a physical weight. Hermione stopped. She looked at him. His face was a mask of cold, weaponized apathy. But his eyes were dark. They were the eyes of someone who had seen terrible things and couldn't unsee them. "I know people died," she said quietly. "I was there." Malfoy looked away first. He kept his attention on the spines of the books on the nearest shelf. "Then you know this is pointless," he said. His voice was completely flat. "A mentorship program won't fix it. They don't want to be mentored by us. And we don't want to talk to them. Your first years are failing Transfiguration." Malfoy went perfectly still. Hermione pressed her advantage. She leaned forward, pushing her notes out of the way. "I pulled the academic records," she said. "With McGonagall's permission. Half the Slytherin first years are failing. Because they are too terrified to ask questions in class. Because the older students won't partner with them. They are falling behind." Malfoy didn't say anything. His jaw flexed. A sharp, tense movement. "They need help," Hermione said softly. Malfoy finally faced her again. The apathy was gone. He looked cornered. He looked angry. "I can tutor them," he said sharply. "In the common room. You are one person. You can't tutor an entire house in every subject. I have 8 NEWTs. I am perfectly capable. You also look like you haven't slept in a month." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Malfoy lost his voice. He held her gaze. It wasn't his usual cold glare. It was genuine shock. He looked completely taken aback that she had noticed. Hermione felt the heat rush to her cheeks. She immediately looked down at her notes, aggressively organizing the edges of the parchment. "My point is," she said quickly, "the mentorship program spreads the burden. And it forces the other houses to see the Slytherins as individuals, not just as a monolith." Malfoy didn't say anything for a long time. He just watched her. Finally, he reached across the table. He picked up the 30-page packet. "Page 14. He said dryly. Hermione blinked. "What?" "Your psychological matching criteria on page 14 is fundamentally flawed." Hermione blinked rapidly at him. Then she scrambled to find her own copy of the packet. She flipped frantically to page 14. "Flawed? How is it flawed?" "You're prioritizing shared hobbies over temperament." Malfoy leaned his elbows on the table. He was actually reading the text now. "If you pair a highly anxious Slytherin with an overwhelmingly extroverted Hufflepuff just because they both like herbology, the Slytherin is going to shut down completely." Hermione read the paragraph. She chewed her bottom lip. He was right. "Oh," she said softly. "Yes." "Oh." Malfoy picked up his silver quill. "You need to pair the anxious ones with the quiet Ravenclaws. People who will sit in the greenhouse and not demand conversation." Hermione looked up at him. "You read the proposal," she said. Malfoy froze. The silver quill stopped moving above the parchment. "I skimmed it." He lied smoothly. "I gave it to you yesterday. You read 30 pages in one night. I am a very fast reader. You actually care about this." "I absolutely do not." Malfoy aggressively crossed out a line on page 14. I am simply correcting your terrible methodology. I cannot attach my name to a project this poorly conceived. Hermione smiled. She couldn't help it. It was a small, genuine smile, right in the middle of her face. Malfoy looked up, saw the smile, and immediately scowled. Don't look at me like that. He snapped. Like what? Like I'm a stray Kneasel you just found in the rain. I don't look at you like a Kneasel. Kneasels are cuddly. I can be cuddly. The words hung in the air. Hermione stopped breathing. Malfoy stopped moving entirely. He looked absolutely horrified by what he had just said. A faint, unmistakable flush of red crept up the back of his neck. Hermione desperately wanted to laugh. But she didn't. She just looked down at her notes, fighting the enormous smile on her face. Right, Hermione said, her voice perfectly even. Quiet Ravenclaws for the anxious first years. I'll adjust the parameters. They worked in silence for the next 20 minutes. It wasn't a hostile silence. It was just quiet. The scratch of their quills against the parchment was the only sound. They passed files back and forth across the red line. Malfoy's elbow crossed into her territory twice. She didn't point it out. Then, the heavy oak doors of the library swung open. A group of older Gryffindors walked in. Cormac McLaggen was leading them. He was laughing loudly, his voice carrying across the quiet room. Madam Pince immediately shushed him from the front desk. Cormac lowered his volume, but he didn't stop talking. He and his friends walked down the main aisle, heading toward the back tables. They passed right by Hermione and Malfoy. Cormac stopped. He inspected the table. He checked Hermione's massive piles of notes. Then he focused on Malfoy. Cormac's face twisted into a sneer. Careful, Granger, Cormac said loudly. You might catch something. Hermione's head snapped up. Malfoy didn't move. He kept his eyes fixed on the parchment in front of him. His expression went completely, utterly blank. The cold, untouchable mask snapped back into place instantly. Excuse me? Hermione said sharply. Cormac laughed. It was an ugly sound. I'm just saying. You're sitting awfully close to the trash. Don't let him steal your notes. They're probably trying to figure out a new way to cheat on their NEWTS now that their daddies are locked up. Malfoy's hand tightened on his quill. His knuckles went white. But he didn't say a word. He didn't even look up. Hermione felt a sudden, blinding flash of pure anger. She stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the stone floor. The sound echoed through the entire library. McLaggen, Hermione said. Her voice was deadly quiet. It wasn't her usual fast, earnest tone. It was the voice of a war veteran. Cormac stopped laughing. He looked at her. Yeah. Apologize. Cormac blinked. What? You heard me. Hermione stepped around the table. She placed herself squarely between Cormac and Malfoy. Apologize to him. Cormac checked her, then Malfoy, then her again. He scoffed. You've got to be joking. It's Malfoy. I don't care who it is. Hermione's eyes were blazing. You do not speak to students like that in this school. You do not bring up the war to score cheap points in a library. He's a Death Eater, Hermione. He is a student. Hermione fired back. He is an 8th-year student, just like you. The war is over. The trials are over. The ministry cleared him to return to this school, which is more than they would do for you if you don't back away from my table right now. Cormac's face flushed dark red. You're defending him? Cormac demanded. After everything they did? I am defending my co-chair, Hermione said fiercely. And I am defending Slytherin House. We are running an integration committee. If you have a problem with house unity, you can take it up with Headmistress McGonagall. I'm sure she would love to hear your thoughts on calling her students trash. Cormac gaped at her. He looked completely bewildered. Hermione didn't back down. She held her ground, her chin raised, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She looked absolutely terrifying. Walk away, Cormac, she said softly. Cormac muttered something entirely foul under his breath. He shot one last venomous look at Malfoy, then turned and stalked away, his friends hurrying after him. The library fell completely silent. Hermione stood there for a moment, breathing hard. Her pulse was hammering against her ribs. Slowly, she turned around. Malfoy was looking at her, his posture completely still. The blank mask was entirely gone. He looked stunned. He looked like she had just slapped him across the face. His silver quill had snapped in half in his hand, the ink pooling silently onto his parchment. He hadn't expected her to say anything. He had expected her to sit there and let it happen. He had expected her to agree. Instead, she had stood between him and a threat. She had defended his house. Hermione checked the broken quill. She noted the ink on his fingers. Suddenly, she felt incredibly embarrassed. She had lost her temper. She had caused a scene in the library. She had screamed at a fellow Gryffindor. She quickly sat back down. She started shoving her files into her bag. Her hands were shaking slightly. I'm sorry, she said quickly, avoiding his gaze. I shouldn't have yelled. Madam Pince is going to ban me for a month. Malfoy didn't speak. Hermione shoved the 30-page proposal into her bag, completely ruining the edges. She grabbed her red quill. I have to go, she said. I have a perfect patrol. I'll see you tomorrow. She stood up, slung her bag over her shoulder, and practically bolted for the library doors. Malfoy didn't stop her. He sat alone at the small table. He studied the red line drawn down the middle of the wood. Then he watched the doors where she had disappeared. His throat felt incredibly tight. He couldn't seem to draw a full breath. Granger actually cared. She wasn't doing this for her resume. She wasn't doing it because McGonagall forced her. She actually, fundamentally cared what happened to his house. Malfoy looked down at his ink-stained fingers. He was in so much trouble. Part 3. The push and pull you smell like expensive cologne and dungeon damp. Hermione didn't look up from her arithmancy essay. She just turned the page of her textbook with a little more force than necessary. I have been in the library, Hermione said. Ginny Weasley sat down on the arm of the sofa. She crossed her arms and looked down at her. You haven't been in the library. You were in the dungeons. The committee meets in the Slytherin common room. It's 9 o'clock at night. We have a lot of planning to do. Ginny leaned closer. She sniffed the air. It's bergamot, Ginny announced. And cedar. It's a very nice cologne, honestly. But it's definitely Malfoy's. Hermione finally put her quill down. She looked up. We are sitting at the same table, Ginny. I am bound to pick up ambient scents. You yelled at Seamus today. Hermione felt a sudden prickle of heat on the back of her neck. Seamus was being ridiculous. Seamus made a joke about ferrets. And you took 30 points from Gryffindor and gave him a 20-minute lecture on post-war prejudice. I am the head girl. It is my job to you defending him. I am defending the principle of house unity. Hermione. Ginny's voice dropped. It wasn't teasing anymore. It was entirely serious. You're spending 3 hours every night with him. You're snapping at anyone who mentions his name. And you look like you're going to jump out of your skin every time someone opens the portrait hole. That's just stress. It's not stress. Ginny touched her arm gently. Just be careful. He's not exactly safe. Hermione looked down at her ink-stained fingers. She thought about Malfoy snapping his silver quill in the library. She thought about the completely stunned, unguarded look on his face when she had offended him to Cormac McLaggen. Safe was a relative term. I'm fine, Hermione said softly. She started packing her books into her bag. I just have a lot of work to do. You're going back down there right now, aren't you? Hermione didn't answer. She just pulled the strap of her bag over her shoulder and walked out of the portrait hole. The Slytherin common room was still freezing. Hermione didn't mind it as much tonight. The walk down from Gryffindor Tower had been long enough to cool the flush in her cheeks. Malfoy was already at the table. He had pushed the 2 armchairs closer together. There was a fire roaring in the hearth, throwing warm, flickering light across the dark leather. He had a stack of parchment in front of him, and he was actually writing. Hermione paused in the doorway. He looked comfortable. He had pushed the sleeves of his black jumper up to his elbows. The harsh, defensive lines of his shoulders were relaxed. Then he looked up and saw her. The relaxation vanished instantly. His posture went rigid. He carefully placed his quill down on the table. You're late, Malfoy said. His voice was clipped. Dry. But it wasn't cold. I was finishing an essay, Hermione said. She walked over to the table. She dropped her heavy bag onto the stone floor. She pulled out the chair next to his. It was much closer than they had sat in the library. Malfoy didn't move away. He just watched her sit down. We have to draft McGonagall's speech for the launch assembly, Hermione said. She started pulling out files. It needs to strike the right tone. Firm, but welcoming. Authoritative, but hopeful. You want to write a speech for the headmistress. She asked us to draft it. She asked you to draft it. I am fairly certain she assumes I'm just here to carry your parchment. Hermione paused. She looked at him. You're the co-chair. She said, your name is on the bottom line, which is why you color-coded the agenda without consulting me. I consulted you. You told me all my ideas were terrible. They were terrible. Tea pairings, Granger. Honestly. Hermione scowled. She grabbed a blank piece of parchment. Fine. What is your brilliant idea for the opening paragraph? Malfoy leaned back in his chair. He crossed his arms. We don't open with hope. He said, hope is cheap. You open with the facts. Which facts? That the school is fractured. That everyone is waiting for Slytherin to fail. Hermione stopped organizing her files. She looked at him. That's a bit dark for a welcome assembly. It's the truth. Malfoy's voice was completely even. If you stand up there and talk about sunshine and unity, no one will listen. The Gryffindors will think you're soft, and the Slytherins will think you're lying. Hermione bit her bottom lip. She considered it. Acknowledge the tension, she murmured. Name the problem so it loses its power. Exactly. That's actually very smart. Malfoy gave her a long, flat look. I was second in our class, Granger. I am occasionally capable of intelligent thought. You were only second because I let you be. The corner of his mouth twitched. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. But it was there. You didn't let me do anything, Malfoy said smoothly. I simply didn't have the time to memorize the entire library like you did. I didn't memorize the entire library. I synthesized the material. You color-coded it. Color coding is highly effective. It's unhinged. Hermione laughed. It was a sudden, bright sound in the dark, damp room. It echoed off the stone walls. Malfoy stopped completely. He looked at her like she had just performed an impossible piece of magic. The silence between them stretched out. It wasn't the hostile, defensive silence from their first meeting. It was heavy, thick. Hermione felt her pulse speed up. She suddenly realized how close they were sitting. She could smell the bergamot and cedar Ginny had mentioned. It was sharp and clean and completely surrounding her. Right, Hermione said quickly. She looked down at the blank parchment. Her cheeks felt very warm. We open with the facts. Give me a sentence. Malfoy didn't look away from her face. Hogwarts is broken, he said quietly. Hermione picked up her quill. That's a bit too brief. We are standing in the ruins of a war. Better, but still a little dramatic. You want me to write a speech for Minerva McGonagall, and you're telling me it's too dramatic? Point taken. Hermione started writing. They worked for an hour. It was the most productive they had ever been. They passed the parchment back and forth. Malfoy crossed out her overly long sentences with sharp, precise lines. Hermione aggressively underlined his best phrases. They were arguing over the closing paragraph when it happened. It needs to end on a call to action. Hermione insisted. She tapped her wand against the table. Something about looking to the future. It needs to end on a warning. Malfoy countered. Tell them what happens if they don't integrate. The house system collapses. We can't threaten them into unity. It's not a threat. It's a consequence. Hermione groaned. She reached for the silver inkwell sitting between them to dip her quill. Malfoy reached for the exact same inkwell at the exact same time. His hand closed over hers. He didn't pull away. Hermione stopped breathing. His hand was warm this time. His long fingers rested lightly over her knuckles. The contact was absolutely electric. The heavy silence crashed down over them again. Hermione kept her eyes fixed on the silver inkwell. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin. She could feel the slight tremor in his fingers. She should pull away. She was the head girl. He was Draco Malfoy. They were in the middle of an argument about school policy. She didn't move a single muscle. Slowly, Malfoy's fingers shifted. He traced the edge of her thumb with his index finger. It was a tiny, deliberate movement. Hermione gasped softly. She finally looked up. Malfoy was entirely focused on her. The distance between them had somehow vanished. He was leaning into her space, his shoulder brushing against hers. His eyes were dark, intense, and completely unreadable. "Malfoy," she whispered. "Granger." His voice was barely a rough exhale. Hermione swallowed hard. Her brain was screaming at her to organize her files. To color code something. To put a barrier between them. Near the closing paragraph, Hermione stammered. She tried to pull her hand back, but his fingers tightened just slightly, anchoring her in place. "What about it?" he murmured. It needs to be hopeful." Malfoy leaned a fraction of an inch closer. "I don't do hopeful. You have to." Hermione's voice shook. "For the first years." "I'm not thinking about the first years right now." Hermione felt the floor drop out from under her. She looked at his mouth. She couldn't help it. She looked at the sharp line of his jaw, the curve of his lower lip. Malfoy tracked the movement of her eyes. He stopped completely. He watched her mouth. He watched the way her breath hitched in her throat. The intellectual argument they had been having completely evaporated. Hermione forced herself to pull her hand away. She grabbed her quill. She gripped it so tightly her knuckles turned white. "We should wrap up," she said. Her voice was too high. Too fast. "It's late. We have classes tomorrow. And the assembly is on Friday." Malfoy didn't answer. He just kept watching her. The intensity in his eyes was overwhelming. It wasn't cold. It wasn't apathetic. It was dangerously focused. "Right," Hermione babbled. She started shoving parchment into her bag. "I'll finish the final draft in the library tomorrow. You can review it before dinner." She stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the stone. Malfoy finally leaned back. He broke the proximity, sinking back into the shadows of the armchair. "Good night, Granger," he said quietly. Hermione practically ran out of the common room. She didn't look back. Malfoy sat alone by the dying fire. He looked at the silver inkwell. He had completely lost the thread of the argument. He couldn't even remember what they had been debating. He only knew that if she had stayed 1 minute longer, he would have kissed her. Part 4. The crack Hermione Granger was running on fumes. It was a Tuesday night, 2 days before the launch assembly, and her hands were shaking. She sat at the large table in the Slytherin common room. Her arithmancy textbook was open on her left. Her ancient runes translation was open on her right. Directly in front of her was the massive, final roster for the inter-house mentorship program. She needed to finalize the pairings by midnight. She picked up her green quill. Her fingers fumbled. The quill slipped out of her grip, rolled across the parchment, and left a long, wet streak of emerald ink across a third-year Hufflepuff's name. Hermione let out a frustrated sound that was half sob, half groan. She aggressively grabbed her wand, vanished the ink spill, and picked up the quill again. Her vision blurred. She had slept 4 hours in the last 2 days. Between her NEWT revision, her head girl duties, and the committee, she was entirely stretched beyond her limits. But she couldn't stop. If she stopped, the launch would fail. If the launch failed, Slytherin would be disbanded. She couldn't let that happen. Not anymore. She dipped the quill. She tried to focus on the next name. Astoria Greengrass. Slytherin. 4th year. The letters swam together on the page. It had been a brutal day. First, she had argued with McGonagall over the catering budget for the launch. Then, she had mediated a dispute between a 6th-year Ravenclaw and a 5th-year Gryffindor in the Great Hall. By the time she had finished her perfect patrol, the castle was entirely dark and she was running on sheer, stubborn adrenaline. The common room was quiet. The fire was burning low. Draco wasn't sitting at the table with her. He was across the room, tucked into the darkest corner of the green leather sofa, entirely silent. They hadn't spoken about the near-kiss over the inkwell. They hadn't spoken about much of anything except the launch. The tension between them had settled into a heavy, unspoken weight that made it hard to breathe. Every time she looked at him, she remembered the intense, focused heat in his eyes. Every time he handed her a file, she remembered the exact feeling of his long fingers over hers. It was distracting. It was dangerous. And she simply didn't have the cognitive capacity to deal with it right now. Hermione closed her eyes. Just for a second. Just to rest them from the harsh glare of the silver lamps. She rested her forehead against her hand. The stone floor was cold, but the air near the fire was warm. The crackle of the logs was rhythmic. Hypnotic. She just needed 1 minute. 60 seconds of quiet. Then she would finish the roster. Hermione took a slow, deep breath. She didn't open her eyes. Draco listened to the rhythm of her breathing change. He didn't look up from his book immediately. He waited 3 full minutes, tracking the sound of her exhales. They went from shallow and ragged to deep, slow and even. Only then did he lower his book. Granger was asleep. She was slumped sideways over the table, her head resting on her folded arms. Her messy bun was unraveling, spilling curls across the edge of the mentorship roster. Her red and green quills were scattered around her hands. Draco stood up. He walked over to the table. His footsteps made absolutely no sound on the stone floor. He stopped next to her chair. He looked down at her. She looked exhausted. Even in sleep, there was a tiny, stressed crease between her eyebrows. There were dark, heavy shadows under her eyes. She had ink on her cheek. She was working herself to death. For Slytherin. For him. Draco felt a sudden, heavy pressure in his ribs. He had spent the last 3 days trying to put the armor back on. He had tried to be cold. He had tried to build the wall back up after he had almost lost his mind and kissed her over an inkpot. He had deliberately sat across the room tonight, trying to keep a safe physical distance between them. It wasn't working. He couldn't look at her without remembering the way she had stood between him and Cormac McLaggen. He couldn't hear her voice without remembering the way she had whispered his name. Draco checked the parchment on the table. The roster was only half finished. There were dozens of names left to sort. She had meticulously highlighted the personality traits of every student in the school, trying to find perfect matches. It was the most Gryffindor, overachieving, completely insane thing he had ever seen. And it was brilliant. He knew what she would do. She would wake up in an hour, panic, and stay up all night to finish it. She would go to her NEWT classes tomorrow completely exhausted. Draco checked the cold stone walls. The fire was dying down. The dungeons were freezing. Granger shivered in her sleep. Draco didn't think about it. If he thought about it, he wouldn't do it. He reached up and unwound the heavy, wool Slytherin scarf from his neck. It was thick and warm, woven in deep emerald and silver. He stepped closer to her chair. Carefully, gently, he draped the scarf over her shoulders. He tucked the edges around her, cocooning her in the warmth. Granger let out a soft sigh. She nuzzled her face into the wool. Draco stopped moving entirely. She was wearing his colors. She was wrapped in his scarf. The image hit him so hard he actually had to close his eyes for a second to regain his balance. When he opened them again, he didn't wake her up. Instead, he pulled up the chair on the opposite side of the table. He reached across the space and gently pulled the half-finished roster out from under her elbow. He picked up her red quill. He picked up her green quill. He checked the criteria she had written out. Draco began to write. It was a slow, meticulous process. Draco worked his way down the list of second years. He cross-referenced Granger's psychological profiles with his own knowledge of the students. He knew which Slytherins were anxious. He knew which ones were prone to acting out when they were scared. He paired them carefully, matching them with calm Ravenclaws and patient Hufflepuffs. He mimicked her complex bracketing system perfectly. He used the red ink for Gryffindor, the blue for Ravenclaw, the yellow for Hufflepuff, and the green for Slytherin. The common room grew colder as the night wore on. The fire reduced to glowing embers. Draco kept writing. He was exhausted too. He had his own NEWTs to study for. He had his own demons to fight. But every time his eyelids started to droop, he looked across the table at Granger. She looked so peaceful wrapped in his scarf. He finished the last page of the roster at 3 in the morning. He capped the quills, stacked the parchment neatly in the center of the table, and leaned back in his chair. His hand cramped. He rubbed his knuckles, observing the finished work. He had just done her homework. Draco Malfoy did not do other people's homework. He certainly didn't stay up all night color-coding lists for a public relations campaign he had initially called a suicide mission. He stood up. He walked over to the leather armchair by the fire, sinking into the cushions. He would just rest his eyes for a minute. Then he would wake her up and tell her to go back to Gryffindor Tower. He tipped his head back. He closed his eyes. He was asleep before his breathing even slowed. Hermione woke up slowly. It was dark. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers. The silver lamps on the walls were completely extinguished. The entire common room was absolutely silent and perfectly still. She was incredibly warm. She smelled bergamot, cedar, the crisp, clean scent of expensive soap and old parchment. Hermione blinked her eyes open. The stone wall of the dungeon came into focus. Panic hit her instantly. The roster. The assembly. She had fallen asleep. Hermione jerked upright, gasping. Something heavy and warm slipped off her shoulders and landed in her lap. Hermione froze. She looked down. It was a Slytherin scarf. It was thick, expensive wool, woven in emerald and silver. It was completely imbued with the scent of bergamot and cedar. Hermione checked it. She reached out and touched the fabric. It was still warm from her own body heat, but it definitely wasn't hers. She looked up, her pulse suddenly racing. The table in front of her was completely clear. Her arithmancy and ancient runes textbooks were neatly stacked on the corner. And right in the center of the table was the mentorship roster. Hermione pulled it toward her. It was finished. Every single name had been sorted. Every single pairing had been finalized. It wasn't her handwriting. The letters were sharp, elegant, and perfectly slanted. But the color coding was flawless. Malfoy had used the green ink for the Slytherin students, the red ink for Gryffindor, the blue for Ravenclaw, and the yellow for Hufflepuff. He had even perfectly copied her complex bracketing system for the scheduling times. He had spent hours doing her color-coded paperwork. Hermione felt the air leave her lungs. She looked across the common room. Malfoy was fast asleep in the leather armchair by the embers. His long legs were stretched out toward the hearth. His head was tipped back against the leather. His breathing was slow and even. The dark shadows under his eyes looked even more pronounced in the dim light. He had stayed up half the night to finish her work so she could sleep. The cold, biting, untouchable Slytherin prince had covered her with his own scarf and done her homework. Hermione clutched the green and silver wool in her hands. The armor he wore was completely gone. It was a massive, elaborate lie. Underneath the sneers and the dry apathy, he was entirely soft. "Don't wake him." Hermione jumped. She spun around in her chair. Pansy Parkinson was standing at the bottom of the staircase that led to the girls' dormitories. She was wearing silk pajamas and a heavy velvet robe. Pansy walked slowly across the common room. She didn't make a sound. She stopped at the table. She looked at the finished roster. Then she looked at the scarf clutched in Hermione's hands. "I've known Draco since we were 5 years old," Pansy said softly. Her voice was barely a whisper. Hermione didn't speak. She couldn't. Pansy observed the sleeping boy in the armchair. "He is incredibly selfish, Granger. He was raised to be selfish. He was taught that other people exist to serve him, and that asking for help is a weakness." Pansy refocused on Hermione. Her dark eyes were sharp and completely uncompromising. "He doesn't share," Pansy said quietly. "He doesn't give up his own comfort. And he absolutely never, ever does someone else's work." Hermione gripped the scarf tighter. "I didn't ask him to," Hermione whispered. "I know." Pansy tapped a manicured fingernail against the edge of the finished roster. "That's the point." Pansy leaned slightly closer. "He spent 3 hours matching second-year Hufflepuffs with third-year Slytherins," Pansy murmured. "He used your ridiculous colored quills. He gave you his scarf because the dungeons are freezing." "Pansy, I'm just making an observation. Granger." Pansy stood up straight again. She adjusted her velvet robe. "If you break his heart," Pansy said, her voice dropping to a deadly, even tone, "I will personally curse you so completely that St. Mungo's won't be able to identify what's left of you." Hermione swallowed hard. She met Pansy's gaze. "I'm not going to break his heart," Hermione said fiercely. Pansy watched her for a long moment. Then, very slowly, she nodded. "Good." Pansy turned around and walked silently back toward the stairs. She paused at the bottom step. "Keep the scarf, Granger," Pansy said over her shoulder. "Green is surprisingly decent on you." Pansy disappeared up the staircase. Hermione sat alone in the dark common room. The silence was deafening. She looked down at the scarf in her lap. She looked at the perfectly color-coded roster on the table. She checked across the room at Draco Malfoy, who was sleeping peacefully in the shadows. She lifted the edge of the wool scarf and pressed it to her face. She breathed in the scent of bergamot and cedar. Her pulse was hammering a frantic, undeniable rhythm against her ribs. She was in so much trouble. Part 5. The Stumble. The Great Hall was completely silent. It wasn't the heavy, hostile silence that had hung over the school for the last few months. It wasn't the tense, breath-holding silence that usually preceded a duel. It was the breathless, attentive silence of hundreds of students listening intently. Hermione Granger stood near the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall. Her hands were clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles were entirely white. Headmistress McGonagall stood at the Golden Owl podium. "Hogwarts is broken," McGonagall said. Her voice echoed off the enchanted ceiling, loud and unwavering. Hermione felt a sudden, fierce rush of pride. Those were Draco's exact words. McGonagall had kept the opening paragraph entirely intact. She hadn't softened it. She hadn't dressed it up in diplomatic platitudes. "We are standing in the ruins of a war," McGonagall continued. Her stern gaze swept over the 4 house tables. "And we are letting those ruins dictate how we treat each other. We are punishing the young for the sins of the old. That stops today." Hermione scanned the crowd. The students were captivated. Even the older, more cynical Gryffindors were paying attention. The sheer honesty of the speech was cutting through the prejudice. It was exactly what Draco had predicted. If they had started with hopeful sunshine, the students would have checked out. But starting with the harsh reality had hooked them entirely. Ginny Weasley leaned over from where she was standing next to Hermione. "It's working," Ginny whispered, her eyes wide. "They're actually listening." "I know," Hermione whispered back. Her voice was slightly shaky. "It's working." She looked for the black jumper. She looked for the flash of pale blonde hair. She found him standing on the opposite side of the hall, leaning against a stone pillar near the Slytherin table. Draco wasn't looking at McGonagall. He wasn't looking at the enchanted ceiling. He was watching the Slytherin first years. His posture was completely still. He was tracking their reactions, scanning the Gryffindor table across from them, making sure no one was throwing things at them, making sure they were safe. Hermione felt a sudden, tight pull in her stomach. She hadn't spoken to him since she woke up in the common room wrapped in his scarf. She had panicked, grabbed her finished paperwork, and fled back to Gryffindor Tower to prepare for the assembly. She had barely made it to her morning classes on time. She hadn't even thanked him. She took a step toward the center aisle, gripping the edge of her robes to stop herself from running across the room to stand next to him. But the assembly was ending. McGonagall delivered the final call to action, outlining the new mentorship program and the inter-house study blocks. She explained the scheduling brackets, the same brackets Draco had meticulously color-coded at 3 in the morning. The applause that followed was slow at first, hesitant and uncertain. Then, the head boy stood up and clapped louder. A few Ravenclaws joined in. Within seconds, the applause built into a massive, echoing roar that shook the stone floor. It had worked. The launch was a complete, undeniable success. McGonagall stepped down from the podium. The rigid house tables immediately dissolved as students stood up. It was chaotic, but it was a positive chaos. Students actually began to mingle. A group of Hufflepuff third-years approached a pair of Slytherin girls, asking nervously about the scheduling brackets. The Slytherin girls didn't sneer. They actually pulled out a piece of parchment and started explaining. Hermione smiled. The relief was so overwhelming it made her slightly dizzy. Several 8th-year Gryffindors surrounded her, clapping her on the back and congratulating her. Ginny threw an arm around her shoulders. "You did it," Ginny said, grinning. "You actually did it." "We did it," Hermione corrected automatically. She pushed her way gently through the crowd, dodging excited first-years and dodging congratulatory handshakes. She kept her eyes fixed on the stone pillar on the far side of the room. She had to find him. She had to tell him they did it. Draco watched the Great Hall descend into organized chaos. A Ravenclaw prefect was actually shaking hands with a Slytherin chaser. A group of Gryffindor second-years were comparing class schedules with a group of Slytherin boys who had been completely ostracized all term. The tension in the room had broken. The immediate danger was gone. It was over. The committee was over. The project was over. He didn't feel relieved. He felt completely empty. He watched Granger moving through the crowd. She was beaming. She was talking fast, pointing at the schedules, completely in her element. She was a war heroine who had just single-handedly fixed the last major social crisis at Hogwarts. Everyone wanted to talk to her. Everyone wanted to be near her. She didn't need him anymore. The forced proximity mechanism had expired. There were no more late-night planning sessions in the dungeons. There were no more excuses to sit at the same table in the library and argue about tea pairings. He had done what she asked. He had helped her save his house. Now, she would go back to Gryffindor Tower, and he would go back to being the former Death Eater who sat in the dark. Draco pushed off the stone pillar. He turned away from the light and the noise, heading for the heavy oak doors that led out to the entrance hall. The air in the Great Hall suddenly felt entirely too thin to breathe. He needed to leave before she saw him. He needed to get out before he did something stupid, like ask her to stay. Malfoy. He stopped. He closed his eyes. He took a long, slow breath, forcing the cold, untouchable mask back into place. He locked away the memory of her sleeping in his scarf. He locked away the memory of the near kiss over the inkwell. He smoothed his features until they revealed absolutely nothing. Then he turned around. Granger was jogging toward him. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement. Her hair was falling out of its messy bun, curling wildly around her face. She looked radiant. She looked like sunshine. "You're leaving?" she asked, stopping a few feet in front of him. "The assembly is over, Granger." "I know it's over. It was brilliant. Did you see the first years?" Astoria Greengrass actually signed up for a study group with a Gryffindor. And the speech McGonagall didn't change a single word of your opening. I saw. Hermione's smile faltered slightly. She tilted her head, observing him carefully. The frantic, celebratory energy of the launch began to fade from her expression, replaced by a cautious uncertainty. Are you all right? She asked. I'm perfectly fine. His voice was entirely flat. Clipped. The exact same tone he had used on their very first day in the dungeons when she had tried to hand him the committee charter. Hermione blinked. She took a step closer, closing the distance between them. I didn't get a chance to thank you, she said softly. The noise of the great hall seemed to fade into the background. For the roster. For the other night. It was nothing. You stayed up all night, Malfoy. You finished all of my paperwork. I was bored. Hermione recoiled slightly. The coldness in his voice was a physical blow. You did my work for me, she insisted, her voice rising slightly. You used my colored quills. You gave me your scarf. Don't read into it, Granger. Draco crossed his arms. He lifted his chin, looking down his nose at her. It was his oldest, most defensive posture. It was the posture he used when he was absolutely terrified. The roster needed to be finished or the project would fail. I simply expedited the process. Hermione stared at him. The warmth in her eyes was rapidly cooling into confusion, and then into deep, sharp hurt. Expedited the process, she repeated slowly. Yes. So it was just about the project. All of it. Draco's jaw tightened. A sharp, dangerous flex of muscle. The truth burned the back of his throat. He almost opened his mouth to tell her that it was never about the project. He almost told her that he had stayed up all night because watching her sleep was the only peace he had felt in a year. But he looked at the bright, chaotic great hall behind her. He looked at Ginny Weasley, who was watching them with narrow, protective eyes. He looked at the world she belonged to. A world of light, and success, and people who loved her. He couldn't drag her into the dungeons with him. It would ruin her. Of course it was about the project. Draco lied. His voice didn't waver. It was perfectly, cruelly even. What else would it be about? We were assigned a task. We completed it. The committee is dissolved. The silence between them was devastating. Hermione took a slow breath. Her hands curled into tight fists at her sides. She stood perfectly still, absorbing the blow. Right, she said quietly. Slytherin is secure, Draco said. You have your shiny new legacy, Granger. You can put it on your ministry resume. You don't have to pretend to tolerate me anymore. The words were brutal. He knew they were brutal the moment he said them. He was intentionally burning the bridge so she couldn't cross it again. Hermione actually flinched. She looked at him. Really looked at him. She didn't look angry anymore. She didn't look like the fierce war veteran who had defended him in the library. She just looked incredibly sad. I wasn't pretending. Hermione whispered. She didn't wait for a response. She turned around and walked away. Draco watched her go. He didn't move. He didn't try to stop her. He watched her disappear back into the crowd of celebrating Gryffindors. Ginny Weasley immediately pulled her into a hug, shooting one last venomous glare in Draco's direction. Draco stood completely still. The great hall was loud. The music was playing. The students were laughing. The house unity they had built was blooming right in front of him. He had never felt so entirely alone in his entire life. He turned around, pushed through the heavy oak doors, and walked away into the shadows of the corridor, leaving the light behind. Part 6. The choice Hermione Granger did not handle rejection well. Usually, when she encountered an obstacle, she researched it. She built a color-coded schedule. She wrote a 30-page proposal. But there was no proposal that could fix what had happened in the Great Hall. It was 11 o'clock on Friday night. The castle was completely silent. Hermione marched down the stone steps toward the dungeons. She was ignoring the curfew. She was ignoring her head girl badge. She was ignoring the fact that she had 3 NEWT essays due on Monday. She was wearing the heavy emerald and silver scarf. She didn't care who saw her in it. She didn't care what it meant. She only cared that Draco Malfoy had looked her in the eyes and lied to her face, and she absolutely refused to let him get away with it. The stone wall that concealed the Slytherin entrance was solid and damp. "Sulasar," Hermione said sharply. The stone wall didn't move. "I am the head girl," Hermione announced to the empty corridor. "And I co-authored the Integration Committee Charter. Open the door." The stone ground against itself, sliding back to reveal the dark, freezing entrance to the common room. Hermione stepped inside. The fire in the hearth was burning low. The silver lamps were completely extinguished. The room was empty, except for a single figure sitting in the darkest leather armchair. Malfoy didn't look up when the door closed. "Curfew was an hour ago, Granger," he said. His voice was perfectly, infuriatingly flat. Hermione marched across the stone floor. She stopped right in front of his chair. He was holding a book, but he wasn't reading it. He wasn't even pretending to read it. He was just staring at the dying embers in the fireplace. "You lied to me," Hermione said. Malfoy finally looked up. He took in her furious expression. He checked the heavy green scarf wrapped securely around her neck. A tiny muscle jumped in his jaw, but his face remained completely blank. "I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about," he said smoothly. "You told me that you only stayed up all night to expedite the project." "I did." "You did not." Hermione's voice echoed off the damp walls. "You spent 3 hours matching anxious second years with quiet Ravenclaws because you care about them. And you gave me your scarf because you care about me." Malfoy closed his book. The sound was unnervingly loud in the quiet room. "You have a very active imagination, Granger." "I am highly observant." "You are delusional." Malfoy stood up. He used his height to try and intimidate her, looking down his nose with that cold, aristocratic sneer. "The project is over. You saved Slytherin. You won. You don't have to play the noble Gryffindor savior anymore. I release you from your obligation. I am not playing a savior." "Then what are you doing here?" Draco fired back, his voice finally losing its flat edge. "Go back to your tower. Go celebrate with your friends. You don't belong down here in the dark." "I belong wherever I choose to be. You belong in the light," Draco shouted. The words tore out of him. The aristocratic mask completely shattered. He looked at her, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild and defensive. Draco stepped backward, putting the leather armchair between them like a physical shield. "I am ruined, Granger," he said. His voice was completely stripped of pride. It was just raw, desperate honesty. "My name is ruined. My house is ruined. The only reason anyone tolerates me in this school is because you stood next to me. If you stay down here with me, they will drag you down too." Hermione stopped. The anger vanished entirely, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming ache in her throat. He wasn't pushing her away because he didn't care. He was pushing her away because he thought he was protecting her. Hermione looked at the files in her hands. She was holding a stack of post-launch metrics she had brought as an excuse to talk to him. She opened her hands. The heavy parchment fell to the stone floor. Draco blinked in shock as the files scattered across the ground. Hermione Granger never, ever dropped her notes. Hermione stepped around the leather armchair. She closed the distance between them. Draco didn't step back again. He completely froze. "I am not a project," Hermione whispered. She stopped inches away from him. "And I don't need you to protect my reputation. Granger, you color-coded my rosters, Draco." He stopped breathing. It was the first time she had used his first name. Hermione reached out. She pressed her hand flat against the center of his chest, right over his heart. She could feel it hammering wildly against his ribs. "You gave me your scarf," she murmured, stepping entirely into his space. "You memorized my 30-page proposal. And you almost kissed me over an inkwell." Draco looked down at her. His eyes traced the line of her cheek, the stubborn set of her jaw, and finally settled on her mouth. "I am a terrible idea," Draco whispered. His voice was entirely broken. "I have excellent judgment," Hermione replied. Draco let out a sound that was half laugh, half surrender. He didn't hesitate anymore. He reached out, his hands sliding into the messy curls at the nape of her neck, and pulled her in. The first kiss was desperate. It wasn't tentative or careful. It was years of built-up tension and months of bitter rivalry completely snapping in half. He kissed her like he was drowning and she was the only air left in the room. Hermione grabbed the front of his black jumper, pulling him even closer. Her hands were shaking. His mouth was warm. The scent of bergamot and cedar completely surrounded her. The cold, damp chill of the dungeons vanished entirely. Draco shifted his grip, his hands moving from her hair to trace the line of her jaw, his touch surprisingly, incredibly gentle. He slowed the kiss down, deepening it, shifting the desperate energy into something profoundly affectionate. When they finally broke apart, neither of them moved back. Hermione kept her hands anchored in the soft wool of his jumper. Draco rested his forehead against hers. He was breathing heavily, his eyes closed. "You're entirely insufferable," Draco murmured against her skin. "I know," Hermione said, smiling. "You're going to make me attend inter-house study groups, aren't you?" "Every Thursday." Draco groaned softly, but he didn't pull away. He just wrapped his arms around her waist and held her tighter. 2 hours later, the fire had burned down to nothing but a faint orange glow. The Slytherin common room was completely silent. The scattered parchment was still lying entirely forgotten on the stone floor. Hermione was curled into the corner of the large leather armchair. Draco was sitting next to her, their legs completely tangled together. The heavy emerald scarf was draped over both of them. Draco rested his chin on the top of her head. He was tracing absent, lazy circles on her shoulder with his thumb. McGonagall knew exactly what she was doing. Draco said quietly into the dark. Hermione shifted slightly, resting her cheek against his chest. She was trying to save Slytherin, Hermione murmured, her eyes half closed. She was trying to meddle. Draco pressed a soft kiss into her messy hair. But I suppose I can forgive her for it. Hermione smiled into the dark. Slytherin was rebuilding. And she wasn't going anywhere. The end.